Getting harder and harder to tell the whole truth because unfortunately it is a muted message for us to take responsibility. We live in a world that wants to be divided and blame others.
The Lord be with you. And with your spirit. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials, named Jairus, came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please, come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that, they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
There's a lot happening in the gospel, isn't there? These two stories laid on top of one another, and they're linked. I think clearly they're linked by this period of 12 years. The little girl was 12 years old, and the woman had suffered her hemorrhages for 12 years. And Jesus demonstrates his power over sickness and his power over death in these two miracles laid on top of one another. As I have said before, and I will say again this morning, whenever we read the sacred scriptures, whenever we hear them proclaimed, we have to understand that there's something happening literally on the surface, and then there's the spiritual reality happening at the same time. Now, this little girl, her parents are pleading for her life. She has died. She has died, and Jesus says she's only sleeping. Now, is she dead or is she sleeping? She's dead, but she's sleeping the sleep of death. And are we going to be awakened from death? Are we going to wake up from death? Yes or no? And the answer to that question, the whole point of the gospel, that story is that we are going to be awakened from death. In the same way Lazarus was called out of the tomb, so this little girl is called from death to life. So everybody will be called there. Jesus is going to take our hand, or he's going to call our name, and we are going to rise from the dead. So that's happening. But it's not just death. He also has the power over disease, and there's different kinds of disease. I want to tell a very brief little story about being in a funeral home. And this was a funeral vigil. So it was the night before the funeral service in the church, and the body was there, and the casket was open, and it was a somewhat tragic death. It was a relatively young person, and the relative, I think it may have been the sister, she was a little girl herself, and she said, "They're not dead, they're just sleeping." And and as soon as I heard those words, I thought of this story. And do I believe that? In a sense, she is sleeping, and she will be awakened by the hand and the call of Jesus. So that's happening in that one story. And then we have this woman who is ashamed somehow. Did you hear in the proclamation that she had fear and trembling? She was ashamed, she was afraid, and she was poor. Did you hear that she had spent all of her money? So she was sick, she was poor, she was afraid, she was anxious, but she had heard of Jesus, and she said, "I will go to him. I will reach out to him." And I'm going to quote the gospel here. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." This gift of faith, but this faith had to be put into action. And so she goes to reach out to him. "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately, the flow of blood dried up. "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." I read a reflection, an article on this gospel a few years ago written by a woman named Jennifer Hartline. And I'm going to quote her at a little length here. So I read, quote, "Yes, he healed her body. He stopped her bleeding. But now he was determined to restore her. He would not let her slink away unnoticed and continue in her shame." You see, this disease that she had was a disease that isolated, the disease of being ritually unclean. The menstrual flow made a woman ritually unclean for a period of time every month, but she had been unclean for years and an outcast because of that. Continuing the quote, "When she summoned the courage to admit it was her who touched him, he did what probably no one had done in years. He looked at her. He spoke to her. 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.' He acknowledged her as a person, a woman, a daughter of God. He freed her from her sufferings. Her bleeding had already stopped, So it wasn't her physical suffering he was speaking of. He knew so well that though she was physically cured, if she did not receive the healing in her spirit, she would never be whole. He was telling her to be free of her shame and her embarrassment and her feeling of worthlessness, and to no longer hide in the shadows. He was telling her to hold her head up. Remember that through her faith she was brought healing, and Jesus himself restored her dignity and her worth. He looked into her eyes and affirmed her in love, and now she could truly go in peace. See, there were two healings that had to take place, right? There was the physical healing, and then there was the emotional healing. We read that she fell down at the feet of Jesus before he pronounced this healing on her. Go in peace. She fell down at the feet of Jesus in humility. And what did she do? She told him the whole truth. The whole truth. Do you promise to tell the truth? The whole truth? And nothing but the truth? Some of the most effective and most destructive lies that we can told are half-truths. We can tell ourselves half the truth. We can tell other people half the truth. And let me tell you, Satan is present in every lie, whether it's a half-truth or it's an outright lie. When was the last time you fell down before Jesus to be healed and told him the whole truth? To be before Christ is to be in a place of healing, a life-giving experiencing, purifying, and light. One can't fall down in front of Jesus and tell the whole truth if you don't know the whole truth. So how do you get to know the whole truth about yourself? How do you get to know the whole truth about anything? You got to take some time studying it. You got to take some time learning. You got to look inside of your heart and your mind and see where your deception is, see where your unhealth is, see where your emotional brokenness is, and be able to share that with Jesus as this woman did, telling the whole truth, anticipating not just physical healing, but another healing. So we have to examine our lives. I was reading in preparation for this homily, I was reading yesterday an article about how evil works in us. We can lie to ourselves. Evil gets a toehold into our soul when we consistently have a pattern of self-deception with the intent of avoiding guilt or maintaining a false self-image. And we must have the capacity to look at ourselves honestly and tell the whole truth. To look at ourselves and tell Jesus the whole truth. And if we persist in telling ourselves half-truths or telling ourselves lies, then we are going to seek to deceive others. And this is, again, how the pattern of evil seeks to dwell in our heart. First we lie to ourselves, and then we lie to others, and then we project the evils that we might experience on other people. And there is this sick division that begins to happen because we don't know the whole truth. We won't listen to the whole truth. We want other people to be evil, bad, and wrong, and we won't let the healing light of Jesus into our soul through the window of telling the whole truth. Jesus came to save us not just from physical death, not from 12 years of hemorrhaging. Jesus came to save our souls for eternity. And this story is a story of his power over our physical bodies, but more importantly, over our emotional and our spiritual well-being. So, we should examine our lives regularly. We should tell God in the clearest, most humble, and most profound way, falling before him and asking for the light to tell the whole truth. We should go to sacramental confession regularly. We should examine our lives daily. I am proud and vain. I do not always treat my body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. I neglect my physical needs with a really proper diet. I neglect my spiritual needs by time of prayer and silence and reflection, by reading scripture and spiritual books. I have talents that I'm not using because I'm afraid of failure or by laziness. I'm afraid of what God might ask of me next. I take God's mercy for granted. I strive for good enough and not for excellence, especially in my spiritual life. I have more than I need, and I still struggle to be truly and sacrificially generous. I hold back on absolutely and courageously giving my whole life to God. I can be moody and discouraged. I have not worked tirelessly for the salvation of my friends and family. I have sinned by omission. I have closed my marriage to life by contraception. I have rejected the teachings of the church. I resist being corrected. I grumble. I complain. I bicker. I don't always take responsibility. I drink too much. Any of those resonate with anybody here? Some of that's me. A lot of that's me. But we have to be able to tell the whole truth to God so that He can touch us with His healing power, right? He didn't come to save us halfway. He came to save us, transform us, heal us, and make us whole. It's getting harder and harder to tell the whole truth because unfortunately it is a muted message for us to take responsibility. We live in a world that wants to be divided and blame others. My brothers and sisters, let's take a lesson from this woman who fell at the feet of Jesus with fear and trembling, spoke to Him the whole truth, was healed, was transformed, and went away a new person. Let us have the courage to tell the whole truth.